We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with our resident legal eagle, Scott DeCosenza, talking liberty on all things constitutional. Now, Scott, great to have you back. And you brought my attention to a case out of the Supreme Court that I found both odd and surprising. Care to give us the details?
The case is Ocala v. Rojas, and the Supreme Court declined to take the case. And the reason why it's sort of newsworthy is that both Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas wrote from the bench to discuss the declination of cert, like we talked about. So the cert petition was denied, and they wanted to discuss it. And the case surrounds some people who went to a prayer vigil after, I think it was a school shooting, some kind of mass shooting type event. And the vigil was marketed or announced by the city as a city-sponsored event, but it was a prayer vigil. And the attendees went knowing that it was marketed and supposed to be a prayer vigil, and they are avowed atheists, and they sued because they said that it was a violation of their First Amendment right to be free from the establishment of a religion to have the chief of police, I think, and maybe, I can't remember if the mayor was there.
The chaplains, I believe, who were...
Well, yeah, but the chief of police was exactly. At this event and speaking, and does that constitute an establishment violation? So they sued saying this is a violation of the Establishment Clause. You can't do this, and we should get paid for it. Basically, that's the
So two things. Now I have looked into this, and as mentioned off camera, Scott, I don't believe that I have understood the intricacies of it well. So if you could just hear me out on this and then say yes or no.
Okay. Yeah, please.
So what's happened is the plaintiffs brought this came to the Supreme Court, but they're asking essentially for standing, right? They're asking for permission to sue, and it got sent back to the lower court.
Okay, so we're talking about the procedural.
Sue.
We're talking about the procedural issues now, not the substantive issues. Just
no,
to make
my
clear.
Second question is substantive.
Well, let's talk about the procedural.
Sure.
First, so the procedural aspect is that they have sued the city, and the city has said we shouldn't have to defend this. This is not a lawsuit we should have to defend for a couple of reasons.
Sure.
And the city has lost that now. The city got all the way to the Supreme Court, not with the merits of the case, but just with whether or not they have to defend the lawsuit on the merits. And the Supreme Court has said they're not interested in rescuing the city from having to defend it on the merits. This could come back to the Supreme Court at a future date after that ruling on the merits is handled by the lower courts. But those hearings on the merits are expensive, they're cumbersome, and no plaintiff, or rather no defendant, wants to do it if they don't have to. And so that's why we've come this far up to the Supreme Court with a challenge on that fight about whether they have to fight on the merits. So now things go all the way back down to the district court level, where they will fight about whether or not this is a First Amendment violation. The city does have to, based on this ruling from the Supreme Court denying them, the city will have to defend itself, or just cut a check and admit wrongdoing, which I don't suspect they'll be doing. I can imagine their insurer would approve of such a measure, but
it's a rash strategy, isn't it? Paying out, although we have seen that in many blue states of late.
You never, as a lawyer, I would never want to criticize a defendant just for paying, because it often is actually the better choice all in an economic analysis of
Absolutely. So this brings me to the substantive issue, and this is where my mind thought, Mark, you're not understanding it. You've gone crazy. This can't be correct. Hear me out. The plaintiffs went to something that was called a prayer vigil.
Indeed.
And were offended, I quote this, I think, offended to find chaplains, who I believe their job is to, pray about things and provide spiritual counsel, to find chaplains praying at a prayer vigil.
Yes.
And they were surprised.
Well, they didn't argue that they were surprised, actually. That's not a part of, as I understand it, that's not a part of their petition or complaint. In fact, there was a lack of surprise, which is part of the defense
Right.
that the city has offered, and I think Justice Thomas perhaps spoke about in his writing.
Sure. So that does bring me to an important, what I think is an important question, Scott. They were offended then, yes?
Oh yes.
Okay. So now to have that offense, do you have to be present?
Well, they were present, so we don't yet know the answer. By the way,
Okay.
I see where you're going with
So
that,
they were
and
not surprised, but they put themselves in a position where they knew they would be offended.
yeah,
Is that?
let's be clear though
Yeah.
that their claim is not just simple offense, which is
Sure.
not a violation of the Constitution. Their claim is that it was an offense.
I know some people with blue hair who would argue
Yeah,
otherwise,
well,
Scott, but please
we're not
continue.
on Twitter though on this program. The the claim is that it was an establishment clause violation,
Okay.
and that their offense is the injury or the damage. And actually, that's one of the key pieces of what the legal analysis will be. And in fact, both Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch, when they write about it, you might say, well, why bother writing about it?
Mm.
Well, to influence the lower courts, for instance, may be one of the reasons why they wrote about it, and to encourage those lower courts to see the issue the way that the justices see it. And so if they say, for instance, and again, I think it was Thomas maybe who said that offense should not give rise to and does not give rise to standing for this type of injury. So it would be one thing if, well, I don't even want to get into the speculation about what other
Sure.
kinds of injury we might have, but in this instance, that's exactly what part of this fight's going to be about. And I don't think it's quite as preposterous as you say, meaning the way you've laid it out, certainly it is preposterous that, but if the Constitution does forbid this kind of establishment, you could see a case, for instance, Mark, where they only do certain kinds of prayer vigils, right? Referencing a non-ecumenical issue with a higher power, but a Christian focused one, or a Muslim focused one, or a Jewish focused one, and how that might be discriminatory to other faiths, for instance, or to people like the plaintiffs here that are not faithful.
I think that's quite an interesting distinction you make there. So this prayer vigil that took place, it was advertised, but it appears to have been advertised without concern. So why would the city think that doing a prayer vigil, as they did, that they wouldn't face an establishment clause
That's
challenge?
the easiest question to answer of all. They're in the wake of a horrific tragedy where members of their community, children, are murdered, and they don't think about those things. They just think of how can we do something to bring the community together, or the quote unquote. And I think this is actually a big motivator for a lot of these people in leadership, is the do something issue, right? Like they haven't protected their community. All they can do is, mop up basically at this point. And this is part of that, is they can go and, just to make one thing clear, the petitioners are not arguing, and I don't think anybody else is arguing, that city leaders or the police chief or other officials couldn't attend a prayer vigil, but the hosting of one and announcing it on the city's media pages as a host and promoter of it, that's a different thing than attending it. So if it was a citywide prayer vigil hosted by community leaders that were not on the government payroll, and the city leaders attended and spoke at that would be a different conversation. This is because it's a city-sponsored and promulgated event.
Okay, and I do have just one final question, because as you know, I'm not a lawyer, don't understand it to much degree at all. But it seems to me that these kind of things do happen. Prayers put forth by federal government agencies, and it happens quite a lot. For example, we see the prayers in Congress, and yet that's not an issue.
Well, that's about the speech rights of the Congress persons themselves, rather than speaking as an institution. Congress can pass laws that are held to be violative of the Establishment Clause by the Supreme Court. So that's how they can act in a way that is in contravention to the First Amendment and then get rebuked for it, right? But they're elected officials. They're not, they're not the chief of police.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, the chief of police actually has power. Scott, thanks ever so much.
But it's not his speech that's being attacked, right? It's his speech in that venue,
yes,
at an event that the city sponsored. So you have to add those parts of the pie to really criticize what they're after.
Well, I am absolutely fascinated to see if this makes it back to the Supreme Court, and we will keep an eye on it here on the Talking Liberty segment of Liberty Nation Radio. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Cheers.
And that's about it for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Thanks to our guests, Lisa K. Donner and Scott D. Cosenza. And thanks to you at home for tuning in. I'll leave you with the words of George Washington himself. The Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon, he said. If only we could trust our current politicians to do the same. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.